everyone. Welcome back to the LDRship Podcast. This is episode 8 on the American involvement in foreign policy, American foreign policy, and just as a caveat, all four of us have served in various roles and responsibilities in the military, various amounts of time. And before we get into kind of an introduction of all of that, I'll apologize up front. I am making this call from a deployed location, Chow Hall, doing hurricane relief operations in Tampa, which is where I'm living right now. Having recently retired, and my family and I moved to Tampa and immediately got hit with 2 hurricanes. And with the military kind of background and experience, I felt a little bit helpless, a little bit like I could be doing more. So I've joined up with Team Rubicon to do some hurricane relief operations. It's been real rewarding so far. I've got about another week out here in the field. So hopefully the Chow Hall internet holds out for us. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Thea to kind of get us going on just providing a little bit of background on our experience in the military and how we have touched on American foreign policy.
All right. Thanks, Will. So when we were talking about what topic to do this week, we, in the wake of last week, when we were debriefing the election, one of the things that I think I know I mentioned, and I think other people may have chimed in, is, well, how does the change in the executive, how does that affect how we will approach the United States involvement in various conflicts that are happening around the world? And so that sparked us to say, well, given that thought process, let's talk about what we think the U.S. role is, the U.S. government role is, and maybe ought to be when it comes to our involvement in foreign policy and specifically foreign conflicts. We wanted to also not make this a huge conversation about all the different ways that the U.S. touches, has is an actor on the global stage, because obviously we understand that, foreign policy can include environmental policy, it can include human rights, but here we're really kind of focusing on conflicts around the world. And so that being said, all four of us, our tie is that we were all officers in the Air Force on active duty, and I know I did some reserve time as well. I'm not sure if the rest of you guys did that, did any reserve time, but I think you guys all retired, so you did more years combined than I did, and I think our experiences in the Air Force shaped kind of how we look at the U.S.'s role in foreign conflicts. And the irony is, so I've been out. I left active duty in 2015, and I left the reserves in 2022, or I went inactive in 2022. Technically, I'm still in the books. But while I was in, I worked as a support officer. In the Air Force, we call it a force support officer. I always said that we were a jack of all trades, probably master of none. Our motto was cradle to grave care, that we've provided cradle to grave support for U.S. military members and their families. And for me, my role in foreign conflicts on more than one occasion when I was deployed also involved that to grave part. So I was a mortuary officer, trained as a mortuary officer. I had missions that included casualty reporting as well as mortuary support downrange. It varied from, actually being the person to make sure that when a U.S. service member falls anywhere in the world, that they're back home within 72 hours, that their family is notified, that all of their remains are recovered. So unfortunately, that doesn't always happen at one time, to make sure that they go home with dignity. So that means that, when we recover, we take possession of U.S. soldiers' remains, just making sure that they get home to their families. So that doesn't always it's not a pretty job, but it was probably one of the most important jobs I did when I was in the military. In particular when I was in Afghanistan. So I remember being there. I was in my 20s. Everybody joked that we were the chair force, but newsflash, the chair force does mortuary for the entire U.S. military in war zones. We are the mortuary folks, even though overall the Army would own that mission. We tend to own it because we own the aircraft that gets people home. So I say all of that to say, when I saw the impact of what war looks like, we have a lot of fancy weapons, but the human body is a human body, and those weapons they do a lot of damage, and they do a lot of damage regardless of who you are and which side you're fighting on. And when I saw the human toll of that, it made me think twice of like, what are we doing, right? In particular, our mission in Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan starting in the fall of 2009 through the spring of, I was there for about 7 months, the spring of 2010. And I couldn't tell you, and I worked for General Stanley McChrystal. I was part of his staff on US 4 Alpha J1. And I couldn't tell you what our mission was, if I'm being honest. Like I could tell you what it said on paper. I could tell you, but if you were like, what were we doing there, and did we accomplish it? Especially looking back, with 15 years in the rearview mirror, I couldn't tell you what we were doing there, and that's a problem. So when I think about the role in that our government should have, I think whatever action we take overseas, especially if we're going to invoke our military, it needs to be one where we have a clear mission, and that we really are leaning towards solving some type of problem that fits with our values as American people. We've talked about the government, U.S. government existing for the people and by the people. And I think that when we get involved in foreign conflicts, we really need to have the support of the American people and the buy-in of the American people to understand what we're seeking to accomplish. And I don't think we've had that clearly in a number of our conflicts in this century. And that's where I struggle, right? So right now we have Ukraine, and we have Israel and Gaza, those conflicts going on. I actually have differing opinions. I do believe that, nations have the right to defend themselves. Therefore, when one nation invades another, I do hope that, us as an ally, we would come to their aid. But I have a lot of trepidation about what that means, what that aid looks like. So I hope that's what we're going to talk about. So I guess that's a long way of me saying I'm a little bit of a war dove. I'm not 100% anti-war. That would be silly. I was not a conscientious objector. I can fire a weapon with the best of them. I can shoot expert, but at the same time, I do think that sometimes we're a little too eager to use the sword and maybe not the pen when it comes to how we approach foreign conflicts. So let me hear what the rest of you guys have to say about that.
Thanks.
Sure, well, I can jump in here, guys, if you want. So my experience in the military, I was an engineer, right? And so, I always used to joke with people that being an engineer Air Force meant that the Girl Scouts would deploy before we did. We weren't really in a spot to go over and do combat missions a whole lot. But, Thea, kind of on the other side of it, working with aircraft and weapons and things of that nature, knowing that we were designing things specifically to harm people. Right. I mean, that's, what the military is good at is we blow stuff up and we harm people. But knowing that, kind of same thing, I wasn't a conscientious objector, but, I always believed that we should approach it from a standpoint of we engage when necessary. Right. If there's an interest that's there, and it's something that is kind of an America first perspective, where we have to take care of our nation state first. And if that means that we need to support our allies in the world picture, then that's what we do, that kind of stuff. From the Republican Party standpoint, since I'm the rep on that, that's really kind of where they are coming from as well. The platform that the Trump campaign was run on this last time. And I know in the past it's been different. The Republicans have been a bit more pro-military complex, pro-war in that instance, wanting to get involved in foreign wars and stuff. And I would love to see that change personally. But the platform that was run on recently was emphasizing, again, protecting American interests, maintaining that we have a strong national defense, and that we're pursuing the policy of peace through strength, right? Of course, that can vary across multiple different platforms, but it really does initially come from an American first standpoint, that we're prioritizing that American sovereignty and interests when it comes to all of our decisions. But we should approach that with peace through strength. But that should also look like it's done through selective military engagements, right? Where we are really limiting our foreign interventions, where we're not just jumping into anything and everything because we can. We are not the world police force in my mind. That's not how we should approach it. But, we do need to still maintain that we have a good, a tough stance on our adversaries, right? We don't just let people walk all across the world or step on the little guy without some kind of pushback, right? Now, that doesn't always mean that we need to be the ones to do it, But probably needs to at least be a conversation around that. And that's where we have interests like NATO and some of the interests around that, where we can work with our partner nations to address those. And of course, that always plays into where we're making sure that we have strong allies and shared interest with other nations, because that allows us to work together. But Theo, one of the points that you were making about the way that we've been handling stuff, especially in this century, is that I don't think the American people have been on board with the way the government has been handling these foreign interventions. And I think the big piece of that is probably transparency. We just don't know about it because we're not informed enough about what is actually going on right now. Of course, we all have a background enough to know that you can't just give out all the information because there's security risks that come with that. But I think there is enough that we could inform the people so that they could understand the reasons why we're doing these things. Right. And of course, making sure
Brett,
that we're not.
I'm not sure that it's a lack of information. My hypothesis on this is that ever since we did away with the draft, most people don't care, because most people don't serve in the military, and they know that they're not going to be drafted to go serve in the next war. And it's not that they don't care in the broader sense, but it doesn't have a direct effect on their lives. And so they don't care in that respect, in that, okay, like I care about the soldiers, that it sucks that people are dying, but it's not me and it's not my kids. So, anyways, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
I also think, well, with the America First part, it's also being able to, so I don't know if I agree that it's transparency as much as it is having a clear communication of what it is we seek to accomplish and why Americans should care. Right. So, again, in Afghanistan, it started off with, the Taliban harbored Al-Qaeda that let, and allowed for 9/11 to happen. But then, 20 years later, it was hard to draw that connection, of
it was becoming state building. We were trying to build Afghanistan into a democracy.
And it wasn't I feel like when I was there in 2009, that's what we were doing. Right. We were, vaccinating livestock and trying to teach people how to farm and building roads and all that. And that was in 2009, right when I was there when we did the surge. I was in Qatar when we drew down from Iraq. And, I remember that, WMDs, I don't think we need to have a discussion about what led to that conflict and, the failings of American military or intelligence apparatus. But from the American people's perspective, even if like, okay, Iraq, let's say they had WMDs. I don't know if most Americans can say, well, how that necessarily affected us. Did they believe that Saddam Hussein was going to?
I think in that respect, Thea, we would have to go back and put ourselves in the mindset of where we were in 2002 when they were talking about when 9/11 was barely a year old, and then what they were telling us on the news was Saddam Hussein was backing Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. So they were trying to tell us that, you think 9/11 was bad when they crashed a plane into a building. Just think how bad it's going to be when they bring a briefcase nuke into the middle of New York or San Francisco or something. So yeah, from 20 some odd years later, it's easy for us to look back and go, well, that was all crap. But in the moment, I can see how they sold it. And
I guess I always had a skeptical view because I was already at the Air Force Academy on 9/11. I was at the Air Force Academy on 9/11. And so when Iraq was popping off, I was getting ready to graduate and all of that. But I guess you're right. I'm looking at it from today's perspective, kind of looking back. But even now, I can understand why the average American can't draw a straight line from Ukraine to us. Like how does what's happening in Ukraine affect, the average person's life? Does it? I'm a poli-sci nerd, so I can do the big picture. I'm sure Will can probably outline it better than I could. But in reality, on a day-to-day basis, I don't know if people can see like whether Ukraine stands or falls, how does that affect somebody living in Idaho, just working a 9-to-5 job? Like, how does it affect their lives? And I think that's where we run into problems with people buying in and supporting these conflicts.
So either way, it's a good illustration of, at least, the George W. Bush administration, we had a more interventionist foreign policy at the time, which has significantly changed to the next Republican administration being Donald Trump's first administration, where we had a much more, you can use isolationist, an American first, bring the troops home. President Trump was the first one to start negotiating with the Taliban about ending the war in Afghanistan. So just from one Republican administration to the next, albeit with 8 years in between, you saw a pretty significant change in the Republican foreign policy stance from a interventionist to quite a bit more isolationist.
Well, and I think that kind of comes from a 15-year window, right? Because you go from, 9/11 in 2001 to 2016. You got 15 years where we've been deployed, right? And overseas, and it's a constant aggression thing. And I think the American people just kind of got tired of it. One, from the stories, but also from the financial aspect, how much goes into funding the military. And again, we all know that because we were part of that process. I mean, gosh, the last program that I worked was a $6 billion program, right? And, for us, we look at that and like, oh, it's $6 billion. That's nothing, for the military spending. But for the average person, that is a big number. And so that perspective, I think, played a lot into that change that happened.
Yeah, and to your point, and Thea's about, the not just that people don't care, but, we've more and more since the elimination of the draft, we talk about having like a warrior caste system where it's always the same families that join the military. So, less and less people even have any tie to the military. Fewer and fewer people even know a member of the military. So not just that they don't care, but there just aren't even that many people that are aware that, obviously they know the military exists, but, without knowing anyone in the military, without reading up in the news on foreign policy and that sort of thing, it's not a part of their daily lives.
Hey, Will, why don't you go ahead and remind us of your military service real quick, like what you did and maybe if you had experience deployed overseas?
Yeah, sure. So I did 6 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and the first 4 were as a navigator on C-130s. It's a cargo aircraft, medium-sized cargo aircraft. Largely, we moved people and equipment from one forward operating base to another. So that was kind of my operational stint. But one of the things I want to kind of touch on is, because we're all coming from a military background and experience, when we talk about American foreign policy, it's not just the military. It's not supposed to be just the military, but largely the military is the biggest, the most well-funded, the most well-organized, the longest logistics arm, to where we often turn to the military for our foreign policy needs. My last 2 deployments were as a political military advisor. And my last one in particular, I worked in the presidential palace for President Ghani in Afghanistan. And, like I said, my first 4 deployments, I was flying C-130s. That's what I knew how to do. And then I got this tasking to advise President Ghani in the presidential palace. And we're writing Afghanistan's national security strategy. We're developing nationwide policies for everything from, they didn't have a vehicle registration system, which, you wouldn't think is tied to national security, but it is when cars keep blowing up. So they needed a way to register vehicles and to track essentially VIN numbers back to the people who own that vehicle. And they didn't have that. So it was interesting to see it from the political side a little bit, but even still, it was from the political side, but with a very heavy military lean to it, just because of what was going on in Afghanistan at the time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And, again, just because of our backgrounds, we're probably going to be discussing, we've already kind of gotten on the Afghan withdrawal and, we call it the foreign policy under Bush versus Trump versus whatever, Obama, but largely it's the military aspect of that. So it's important to just keep in mind that there's more to it than that. It's just as a country, we tend to rely on the military.
And I guess one thing I will, kind of changing the subject or shifting the conversation a little bit. And then obviously Dion needs to do his intro as kind of where he's coming from on this topic. But one thing I will say, when we talk about America first, I feel like that's being tested, at least for me as an individual right now with Gaza. Because if you had, the minute that October 7th happened, October 7th, 2023 happened, I called my mom and I said, this is bad. The loss of life is bad. And I said, and the future loss of life that we're about to see is going to be 10 times worse. And I and it's not a knock. This is not a knock on Israel, but, we train with, when I was stationed in England, we did a lot of training with the Israeli Air Force. I knew what they were capable of as far as like from just a weapon standpoint, like just their capabilities, not like from a moral standpoint, just I knew the type of response that they could do from a military standpoint. And I was just like the impact that could have in such a densely populated area. The writing was already on the wall. And so I bring that up because while I, as a person who grew up in America, I don't know anybody in Gaza. I don't personally know anybody who's a Palestinian American, but I struggle watching that conflict and not feeling like we have some type of obligation, especially with Israel being our ally, to do more than what we're doing to stop the killing of civilians. And so when we talk about, America first, there's that line between there are moments in this world where as human beings, I feel like if you have the ability to save human life or intervene to prevent the loss of human life, shouldn't you do it? And I know that to me, that goes beyond the America first, position that I know at least Republicans have taken. I can't say, and this is where I break with the Democratic Party right now. I completely think the Biden administration, I don't agree with their approach. The keeping Israel close approach. I think that was the wrong call. I don't agree with giving U.S. weapons to an ally without them making them uphold human rights and follow the law of armed combat. Right. So that's kind of where I am when it comes to, yes, I don't know if that's a military position, but I'm looking at a conflict and I'm looking at the role that we're playing, and I don't agree. And I'm disappointed in both parties because I don't think either party has had any or proposed anything that I think gets to a point where we stop the killing or, are waging a massive war. And I don't think it's a war in Gaza that we're seeing right now.
Yeah. And Dion, I don't have a browser in front of me right now, but I think it's the Leahy Amendment where, it's on our books that we're not supposed to give military aid to countries that conduct human rights abuses, which we have ignored in the past when it suits our needs. But Dion, you're last up. Your experience.
Okay, so like Brett, I was an engineer while I was on active duty, and you would think that the Girl Scouts would deploy before us, but turns out for the civilians out there who don't have any military experience who are watching or listening, a while ago, it used to be that like the Army and the Marine Corps, they had like cooks and they had people who cleaned and they had like soldiers and Marines who did all that stuff. And I think it was back in the 80s that they said, you know what, this is ridiculous. Why are we paying for these soldiers, paying to train them to use a rifle and learn tactics and stuff just so that they can be an Army cook? That doesn't make any sense. And so we started contracting that out. And when you contract that stuff out, you need people who run those contracts. And so because engineering, acquisitions, science, those kinds of things seem to for some people in Air Force Personnel Center seemed to have something to do with contracting. They were like, all right, Dion, we need somebody to manage this contract at this FOB out in Afghanistan. So I went to the Kandahar region of Afghanistan for 8 months. Look at it on Google Maps, like look at the satellite imagery. When I landed, when the C-17 ramp opened, first of all, it was like 135 on the ramp. So that was just god awful. And you're wearing all your body armor, you're carrying your bags and everything. So it was just miserable. But it looked like the surface of Mars. Like it seriously looked like I had landed on another planet because there was not a single piece of vegetation or anything. It was just sand and rocks. And I was like, why am I here? What are we doing here? But one of the things that I want to bring up there is just like Thea, that thought kept recurring the whole time that I was there. Why are we here? What are we doing here? What are we trying to accomplish? And one of my biggest disappointments was I was at an Army FOB, and because I was managing the contract there and I was part of the chair force, so I wasn't like a combat person. I was what we call a FOBit. I rarely left the FOB. I definitely didn't go out on any like combat patrols or anything.
For all you non-military folks,
forward operating base. I was going to say, forward operating base.
Define your acronyms, Dion. You should know this. Come on, tongue and quill 101.
Yeah, sorry. And a FOBit is a play on the word hobbit, with somebody who is more comfortable staying at home than going out on adventures. So that's somebody who just stays on the FOB the whole time. But we did catch quite a bit of indirect fire while I was there. So we had plenty of times when rockets, mortars, machine gun fire were coming in at us. And so, whatever you were doing, you'd hit the deck, you'd run to the bunker, whatever. So I got my fair share of getting shot at with never the opportunity to shoot back, which kind of sucked. But anyways, one of the things that really struck me was Thea had mentioned we were trying to teach some of these people like how to farm. And at our FOB, we had an experimental patch of farm, and they had brought out farmers from the United States who were used to farming in, very arid agricultural areas like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, that kind of thing, to teach the Afghans how to farm. And they were there for like 3 months working side by side with the Afghans. Like, here's how you till the soil. Here's how you water it. Here's how you irrigate it. Here's how you aerate. And here's what you should plant. Here's how close to plant, all that kind of stuff. Right. And then they handed it over to the Afghans for a couple of weeks. And they're like, okay, you guys are primary on it. You guys work it and we'll kind of watch you, give you tips. And then they sent the American farmers home. As soon as they sent the American farmers home, the Afghans just sat in their hut smoking hash the whole day and just let all the crops die. And so the foreign affairs officers that were in charge of our region, they were like, well, maybe they didn't get it the first time. So they brought the farmers back. And they taught them, they did this again, right? And the same thing happened. And I was just like, okay, like it's one thing if they wanted to learn, if they wanted to pick this stuff up from us, but they didn't care. They were like, just give us the stuff. They were happy to take like the DFAC tents, that's dining facility. For those that don't know, like DFAC tents and all of our like equipment, like all of our vehicles, all of our, technical equipment, all of our cooking equipment, all that kind of stuff. They were like, yeah, please, we'll take that. But they didn't want to learn from us. They just wanted to do their own thing and have us go away. So I was like, why are we here?
Well, and piggybacking off of that, I remember when I was there. So, okay, we were trying to teach them how to grow, wheat and oats and grain. None of that is as profitable as the poppy fields were, especially if you were down in RC South or you were down in Kandahar. But Afghanistan was divided into 5 regions, Northwest, East, South, and Central. And I would travel around all of them for my job. And so I thought I'd be a FOBit, and I was not. And most of those locations were not ready when I showed up, and I was a woman, and they did not realize that I would be a female. So I would have to sleep in the ops center sometimes because I was at locations that were all male. So the idea that we haven't had women in combat is also a misnomer. Even in combat, when we're there, we weren't always accommodated correctly. But that's another conversation for another day. But anyway, I remember same thing. We're teaching them how to grow grain, but the Taliban wants them to grow poppy. to make heroin and opioids. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I am an Afghan farmer, minus the fact, the pressure, and, a lot of it was involuntary on their part, am I going to really grow grain when, I'm being pressured to grow this other crop? And even if given the choice, what am I going to be paid more for? And we didn't account for that in that conflict. So I think that's a larger issue when we talk about, well, as America, world police, I don't know if you guys remember the movie America, yeah. And that's what it felt like, and I don't want us to be that, but I do want us to not turn a blind eye when atrocities are happening around the world. And it's like, do I want my cake and do I want to eat it too? Like that's where I struggle when I start to look at, well, what should our role be? I do think we should not show up to a country and try to enforce our way of doing things on them, because quite often it just doesn't work. But we should not just I don't think we should leave the world to fend for itself, especially when atrocities are happening. So that's where I struggle.
And I think part of the America First policy, at least in terms of the military, I mean, there's something to be said for the fact that Afghanistan did not go well. One general was fired, and he was fired for saying it would take more people and time, which was the exact same thing that General Shinseki got fired for in Iraq, saying that it was going to take more people and more time than we were being given. So while I generally disagree with most policies that come from the Trump administration, his recent announcement about, he's going to start firing generals, I wholeheartedly disagree with it. But there is something to be said. There's a famous quote in the military that, a corporal who loses his rifle gets in more trouble than a general who loses a war. That, the senior leadership, at least, getting back to the transparency piece, at least what we are given, what we are told, it's hard to see accountability of senior leadership, but it's real easy to see people, lower ranking people getting in significant trouble for relatively minor offenses compared to.
Yeah, and I think one thing to bring up, since you brought up the firing of generals, Will, especially for those of our viewers and listeners who are not familiar with the military, is that especially as officers, which generals are commissioned officers, all officers serve at the pleasure of the president. And a lot of people don't know that. So at any moment, the president has the authority to say, I no longer require your service, and then you are no longer a commissioned officer. So I think that's important to remember, that it comes with the job. And of course, you would hope that you don't have a commander in chief that wields that power irresponsibly. But it is always, something that is hanging over you, that the president can decide, I don't need you anymore.
I think what makes me feel uncomfortable about this proposed policy with firing of the generals is that while officers serve at the pleasure of the president, of the commander in chief, we also take an oath to support and defend the Constitution and not the president. So I think at least where I feel uncomfortable is how that power is used by the executive. Now, the executive takes the same oath. He takes the same oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, like the same oath we took, the president took. So I think, it comes to this whole idea that the government has to exist where there's a trust between these, different branch. Well, actually, it's the same branch of government because the military is part of the executive branch, but there's a trust between people who have chosen to serve, right? And there's a trust in our civilian leadership, right? That the conflicts that we're being sent to and that we're given the resources, the right mission, the right, tools and support to execute those missions. And I think that kind of comes to the role of diplomacy and where we are as, our credibility. Brett mentioned NATO and, the importance of being there for our allies and being a strong presence with, on the world stage and being someone that our allies know that they can rely on. I don't know if that's who we are right now. And I think that's where I also struggle when it comes to.
Is that who we should be, though?
Yeah, I think I guess that's the thing. Choose your friends wisely, though, right? But yeah, if once you say, I feel strongly. If you say you're going to be there, you say you're going to show up, then you show up, right? Or you say you're going to support the NATO as an alliance, then you support NATO as an alliance. If you have strong feelings that that alliance is not accomplishing the mission that it set out to, then you say something and you seek to to get it back on track, or I guess then you leave NATO. But right now, I do think that if we have a commitment to that alliance, and I think that we should maintain it. I don't see any reason not to. I don't think that NATO has gone so far left of center that we shouldn't uphold our end of the bargain there. But I know I guess that's a disagreement, where some people feel like maybe we shouldn't have these long standing ties when it comes to foreign policy.
And
I don't think
just
we
as a
shouldn't have
point
the
of
long-standing ties, but I think, excuse me, sorry, trying to clear my throat here. I think one of the pressures that's really there is that the U.S. shouldn't necessarily shoulder the disproportionate financial burden that comes with it. That's a big part of it. Yes, we are a large country. Yes, we have a lot of money that we can put into our military. But if we're going to be part of NATO, we're not the only one. So if we're taking the brunt of that, that doesn't seem like a fair trade in that instance. And so I think that's probably part of why the alliance is in question, is in terms of like, well, we're doing all the work. Where do the rest of you guys play into this? Like, why can't we just do this by ourselves?
Well, and
let's not forget the history of
are
NATO.
We doing all the work?
So NATO came about right after World War II. And if you remember the state of the Western European countries after World War II, everybody was decimated, right? Not only were their militaries just absolutely demolished from World War II, but also their civilian economies, their infrastructure. The entirety of Europe had to rebuild after World War II. And so, as part of Bretton Woods and all the other agreements that we signed on to, which included the formation of NATO, we largely had an intact military because, other than Pearl Harbor, the United States was not really touched during World War II. So we were able to build up all of our infrastructure and our factories, and we were able to mechanize our war machine like no other, and keep it for the majority of the war and through to the end. And so we kind of made a deal where we said, all right, Europe, you guys rebuild. We will become your military for the time being. In exchange for, we were like, hey, why don't you guys use the US dollar as the reserve currency and things like that? So, we got some economic benefits out of that and things, but that's where it started. And so when we kind of started off bearing most of the brunt of funding and being the personnel and the resources for NATO. And the hope was that these countries would then, pay their 2% like they were supposed to. So I brought up the history of that because NATO seemed very important and very useful, especially with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact looming right there, the Soviet Union developing nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. What I fear today in 2024 is, I believe it's Article 7, right, of NATO, which is an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Article 5, okay. And I really have to wonder in 2024 if there was, say, an attack on, I don't know, Romania. Would the people of the United States be like, yes, solidarity, we got to go. We're going to send troops over there and we're going to fight because they attacked Romania.
So let me ask you this, Dion. The only time that Article 5 has been invoked for the listeners is after 9/11. And no European country, in my opinion, was afraid that if they didn't join us, that they were necessarily like they joined the war in Afghanistan with us because of 9/11 and because of NATO. Afghanistan was a NATO mission. I understand the point that if the organization has achieved its goals or outlived its usefulness, that's one thing. And just because everyone else came to our defense, is that a reason to then go to their defense? It's kind of what an alliance is. But, to me, that example you gave about, if Russia attacks Romania is, to me, very similar to us being attacked by Al Qaeda, that it didn't really affect the rest of Europe, but they were still there for us. Now, albeit at that time, many of them at less than 2% of their GDP funding, but they were still there for us.
Yeah. I mean, I guess.
Go ahead, Thea.
I guess my thing is, and from a personal standpoint, I'm the type of person that I think your word is your bond. And if you don't have your word, what do you have? So I think the discussion needs to be either if we're part of NATO, we're part of NATO. If this is an alliance we think we should not be part of, then we need to be transparent about that and then really have a real discussion of what does that mean? Because you used the example of Romania, but what happens when it's the UK or when it's Germany, right? Then does that change and then we talk about economics, right? We talked about, the cost of things, but what happens when the euro crashes and the European economy crashes because Germany just got invaded? That's a different conversation that will have real ramifications on the American people, even if they don't know, or they're not thinking about it, or, part of what we have our national security apparatus to do is to kind of war game out, what happens if, I think all of us have probably been part of exercises. At least I know I sat through, we all went to SOS, right? You go and you have these like SOS, the Squadron Officer School, for anyone who's, and part of that was they give this some scenario. China attacks on the Western Front, and what do you do? What happens? What does this mean? And part of it is like, are there economic impacts when this conflict happens? Are there diplomatic issues that we need to be aware of? Like it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I guess that's a long way of me saying, when we talk about our foreign policy, I don't think we can just use one example. It's kind of all or nothing, right? Either we're there for Romania or not. But that also means like, if we're not, we're also not there for Germany, or we need to have a different treaty with just Germany if we're going to say we only care when it's certain members of NATO and not others. I think this.
This is where my libertarian comes out a lot, I knew it would in this discussion. Mm-hmm. So I'll just read from the Libertarian platform briefly. It says, American foreign policy should emphasize peace with all nations, entangling alliances with none. We would end the current U.S. government policies of foreign intervention, including military and economic aid, tariffs, economic sanctions, and regime change. And that's a short paraphrase of a much longer section about foreign policy. And I have to say that, when I told my anecdote about Afghanistan, that's probably where I first started to make the shift from being a Republican to being libertarian, was because I kind of saw firsthand the good intents of the people on the ground in extending U.S. aid to others, and how we as Americans, we as the U.S. are sort of received around the world. And I also spent 3 years in the U.K. as a liaison officer, and I got to see that. The U.K. is one of our closest and strongest allies, and we still have friction there because of the way that we are as America. To your point, Thea, about what happens if Europe collapses, if the euro collapses or something, I would offer the counterpoint of what happens to Europe if the United States continues to spend recklessly. We're at $36 trillion in debt. We just got to the point this past fiscal year where the amount of money that we spent just servicing the interest on our debt exceeded what we spent on the Department of Defense. And so if we continue to put ourselves into debt with the world's currency to fund this military and this military police that we have put all across the globe, what happens when the chickens come to roost and we finally can't pay our debt, or the foreign investors in our debt come to collect and we can't pay it, and then the world's reserve currency starts to fail?
I mean, we've talked about in a previous podcast, I don't think the argument is that our involvement in foreign conflicts is what's driving the debt. right? We've already had an economic discussion talking about a lot of our domestic policies and our domestic programs, Social Security and whatnot, that's a huge part of our debt. So even if we were to withdraw or scale back with our our interventions in foreign conflicts, I don't think that changes the issue with our debt. So I understand, I hear what you're saying. Like if we collapse, it has a negative impact on Europe, but I don't think the deciding factor of whether we make it economically as a country is dependent upon whether we do or do not intervene in foreign conflicts or the role that we play in these foreign conflicts. And it's interesting that you said that your time in Afghanistan kind of drove you from the Republican Party to be a libertarian. I think for me, it was, the reaction of the Republican Party after 9/11 that cemented my position as a Democrat, especially, I would say, around the 2004 election, where between 2004 and 2008, where you really were starting to see the Democratic Party push back on our foreign conflicts and just everything being tied to 9/11, everything being fear-mongering, that we needed to stay involved in all these foreign conflicts. That was, for me, pivotal in me just not supporting, the Republican Party. So it is interesting that here we are, not even 20 years later, and you have this conflict within the Republican Party where you still have the Liz Cheneys of the world, whether she wants to admit it or not, who was very much a war hawk. And then you still have the Donald Trumps of the world who, have the America first, they're, supporting the America first, less, more of an isolationist view. So it's interesting to me on the outside looking, being like, well, where do we stand as a Democrats? Because I think a large part of what defined us for a long time was opposing, a lot of the Republican interventionist, war hawk policies. So then it's like, I don't know. I mean, I know, but I don't have a strong feeling that the Democratic Party has a strong stance on where we are when it comes to foreign policy anymore. And that troubles me because, again, that's part of what drew me to the party in the first place.
Yeah, Deanne, to your point about Afghanistan being what kind of drove you towards the libertarians. I mean, the initial objectives in Afghanistan was to remove the Taliban from power, and we did that within 3 months, within 2.5 months of the initial invasion of Afghanistan. We hadn't gotten Osama bin Laden, but we had achieved the objective of removing the Taliban from power in Afghanistan and putting in an interim government. We could have theoretically come home at that point after 2 to 3 months in Afghanistan. And I think that had that happened with a clear kind of exit, you may not then have been driven towards the libertarians, and even, to be honest, even I think the libertarian platform as it stands today, if we're attacked, I don't think the libertarians would say, well, we're just going to stay home and take it on the chin.
You're right.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we can defend ourselves if we're attacked. We just aren't going to go be the world's policeman.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to kind of touch on too, that like the whole America First policy is not a America only policy, right? It's an understanding that, I've always taken it from the perspective of, being on an airplane when they always say like the oxygen mask drops, right? You got to put yours on first before you can be of help to anybody else. So like you have to have a sort of self-preservation, self-interest to be able to be strong enough to help others. And that's what that's there. But, Thea, going back to what a thought you had made earlier really stood out to me was it's about human life, right? There has to be a protection of people that comes with that. And, that's always been one of my standpoints. It's not necessarily as a Republican. It's my standpoint as a Christian that life is paramount. Life comes first, right? We're all God's children from that standpoint. We're humans. We have to look after each other. Just because we have disagreements doesn't mean that we have to be disrespectful. And so I think Brett, that is a policy that.
Brett, I want to come back to that, especially because we were talking. I think Thea brought up the Israel and Gaza conflict and the loss of life there. But I wanted to briefly jump in here in your in your example of like the oxygen masks on an airplane, when I was doing my research, I came across these figures, which I found phenomenal. So I want to preface this by saying what I'm about to say involves potential government spending that I, as a libertarian, would not get behind, but it illustrates the point of you should put your own oxygen mask on first before you help others. So since February 24th of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we have sent approximately $64 billion in aid to Ukraine in various forms. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has estimated that it would cost about $20 billion to end homelessness in America. Now, I don't know how much validity there is to that $20 billion figure. And of course, I, as a libertarian, would not just wholesale endorse a program like that to just go out and end homelessness. But I use that as an illustrative point to say we could have 3 times over solved homelessness in our country, which ostensibly would bolster the economy, add more workers into it, grow our GDP, all these kinds of things, and then help with healthcare, all kinds of stuff, right? It would be all kinds of beneficial. Yet instead, what we chose to do with that money was we sent it to Ukraine to help them fight a war. Now, Ukraine is not even one of those countries where we have any kind of formal alliance or pact or treaty with. So that is one of those things where, on the one hand, having studied history, I understand that keeping your foes as far away as possible and keeping as many hurdles between your foe and you is a good thing. At the same time, I really do like the part of the libertarian platform where they say we should really try to avoid entangling alliances. So that said, go.
So the only problem that I have, and I hear this, especially when I was in law school, I got this a lot from people, that we always make this false dichotomy of, because we're spending money overseas, that's why we're not spending it domestically. And that's just not true in our political environment. Whether or not so the conflict in Ukraine, yes, you gave figures from the last few years, but homelessness in America existed long before that. That same money was there, and we were not spending it to address homelessness in America. And I think I guess my problem with the America First and the analogy that Brett gave is I don't see where, because we're not doing things overseas, then somehow we're actually focusing on solving those domestic issues in the US, that we're spending that money or that we're dedicating our efforts to solving these problems stateside. It just feels like we're just doing less, period. Right. So it's not that we can't do both, because reality is I do believe in our exceptionalism, and I do believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I do believe the way we spend, if we wanted to spend that money on ending homelessness and Ukraine, we would. Because when we look at the trillions we spent on Afghanistan and Iraq, clearly when we need to find the money, we find it. So that's where I always push back when people make the argument, we're getting
2.3 trillion is the estimate for Afghanistan, yes, and 2 trillion for Iraq.
Yes. That money.
Yeah, so Dion, you gave the perfect Democratic argument for the Bush Jr. years of, how come we can keep finding this money for these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? We're asking you for food stamps for like a couple million, and you're like, oh, that's too expensive, But everything that you had just said about, we could end homelessness 3 times over. To Thea's point, well, I mean, we weren't sending aid to Ukraine a couple of years ago, so why didn't we go ahead and end homelessness then?
Well, because we were engaged in 2 simultaneous wars for almost 2 decades. But
that's not a real. That's not. I think that's disingenuous. That's not why we're not spending. It's not that someone's like, well, if we only weren't in Afghanistan, we could address the homeless problem.
I totally agree with you on that, and that's a separate topic. In that, I personally think that the entire federal government is just entirely too bloated, costs too much money, and wastes too much money. Right, but isn't
there going to be this new department that's going to deal with that soon?
Doge, yes. I heard Elon Musk said I would be really great as part of that efficiency plan.
I mean, it's one of those I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's one of those I hope it goes the way that we all think it will in terms of like it actually changes. Like I said, I don't know how it'll actually work. We'll see how that plays out. But like there's that
We're running a
optimism in me
$2
that like,
trillion
man, I really
a
hope
year
this works.
deficit. We're a $2 trillion a year deficit. I don't know how you cut $2 trillion. And that's just to break even, right? That's just to make
Even
it
if
so that what we are spending equals what we brought in revenue.
Even if you fired all of the government civilians, like if I know one of the things they're talking about cutting, shrinking the bureaucracy. Even if you fired every single person, you're not getting $2 trillion out of that. That's not,
No. And I don't think that's where they're going. Like that's going to be part of it. Is they're going to close departments, they're going to fire civilians and everything. But I think it's more that they're going to look for those programs that they can cut.
Yeah.
The things that we are constantly spending money on.
Yeah, because I don't think it's a personnel issue. I think it's where we're spending it. And that's really what it comes down to. Like you guys are talking about how we're spending the money of like, well, if we're not spending it here, we should be spending it here. It's a prioritization issue.
You're right.
That's what it all kind of comes down to. And again, when you look into some of the warmongering that has happened in the past, which is why I think you're seeing a shift in the Republican Party kind of away from, like you said, the war hawk mindset, Thea, is that it's not beneficial except to a few people, in that regards. And I said, I'm well aware of that, and that's why even my standpoint as a Republican, I don't believe that we should be pursuing all these foreign policies there's things that we could focus on here, but it still comes to a prioritization issue. We have to look at how we're really affecting people. And this again goes back to our first discussion of what is the role of government. A lot of that stuff should be handed back down to the states, because homelessness, I don't think you can solve that as a money issue. There's part of money that goes into that, but that's a big mindset issue too. Like you have to teach people differently. You have to inform people about what options are there. And in all honesty, even then, some people are just not going to do it. Just kind of like the Afghans, right? They don't want to do the work. They want the free stuff. And so there has to be a changeover in the mindset to fix that too. So it's not just a financial issue in that instance. And I think that applies to a lot of other things too. But my main point is that it really comes down to a prioritization issue of the people, of knowing where to spend the money. But I think to get away from a lot of that, we need to get away from the central planning concepts that we have. Because if you have one idea that's meant to cross over all 50 states, because I think people fail to realize that, right? This is America, but it's the United States of America. We have one country, but we basically have 50 small experiments going on of how things work and how things run. And we can learn from each other, but we try to peanut butter spread everything across as one country. We do it this way. And it's really just not an effective way to run government.
I mean, I think I don't want to get too far off topic, but I'm just going to reemphasize the ability to do A and B at the same time, right? I agree with Brett when you say it's a prioritization issue, right? So I think some of our domestic problems that we face have not been prioritized in the same way that we have prioritized spending money in foreign conflicts. I think that's just an objective fact. But I don't think it's because I think there's not a cause and effect there. So I guess this is as a lawyer, we always argue, was there a but-for cause? But for the fact that we were fighting a foreign conflict, would we have addressed these domestic issues? And that's where I'm not seeing the connection. I don't think you can make that definitely not a cause and effect, but even a correlation where you're saying.
But wouldn't it make it easier for us to reprioritize money to domestic issues if we were not constantly engaged in foreign conflicts? Right. So if you could take that off the table as an excuse, as Will was saying, during the Bush years, they were saying, well, we're spending all this money in Afghanistan and Iraq, so we don't have the couple million that you need for food stamps.
Now we're not.
If you took that excuse off the table.
Dion, you just made a great point. We spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we are no longer there. So even if we're spending billions in Ukraine, that's a huge delta between what we were spending in those other foreign conflicts. We've now reduced that by trillions of dollars, and we're still not addressing the domestic issues, right? We just had an election where most people argue that the reason that they voted the way they did was because they did not feel that the economy was working for them. So the government still hasn't been addressing that. Now, I will put a huge asterisk. I understand COVID happened and a lot of different things have happened that have kind of taken the focus away from, addressing some of the long-term systemic issues that have a negative impact on low-income Americans. But at the same time, I guess where I'm cynical, I don't think the reason in 2018 that we weren't addressing homelessness in America was because we were still entangled in the conflict in Afghanistan. And I don't know whether us being in that conflict would have, quote unquote, made it easier for us to address those political issues, given the way that our government doesn't especially the legislator, they seem to not want to govern, right? So that speaks to Brett's point.
You there.
Maybe, yeah. So, maybe there's the way we're going about it is wrong, but, I don't necessarily think that the model is wrong, but the way that we're executing the model is wrong. And this idea that, everybody party before the people, I may be a Democrat, but like I said, I'm quick to call the Democrats out when I don't think we're doing the right thing. And for the topic of today, I don't think what we're doing right now in foreign policy is the right thing. And we want to talk about money. Look at how much money we're giving to Israel, and what are they using that money for? What are they using those weapons for? And we're blindly doing it. And unfortunately,
since October 7th, we've actually given them $12.5 billion, but also we have ongoing foreign military sales to Israel. So, one thing that people probably don't know if they haven't spent much time around the military, like all of our fighter jets that Israel buys, they have their own unique version that they buy because they have their very specific weapons systems, capabilities, things that they want to incorporate. So they don't buy like the F-35 A, B, or C variants that we sell to everybody else. They buy the F-35I variant, which is specific to Israel.
And that's what I was alluding to.
So I'm glad you brought up.
That's what I was alluding to was I know the types of aircraft that we've sold to Israel and the capabilities of those aircraft. And that's what I said on October 8th, oh my God, what's coming? That's what I was thinking of, because I know that they have these advanced weapon systems and what those weapon systems are capable of as compared to maybe other allies that we have, that may or may not. The Romanias of the world, they don't have the same level of military capability that Israel does.
Yeah. So we are we're coming up on an hour here, a little bit over an hour, and I think real quick before we end this topic and get into what's been making us happy, we should probably all just kind of talk about very briefly what are our feelings about Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine. Should we be involved? Should we be spending money there? Should we be doing more, or should we be doing less? So, Will, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Dion. So this is a hard one. And, it touches on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about earlier in this episode. There is a piece of, keeping your word as a member of an alliance. There is a part of, upholding human rights. There is a part of the right to defend yourself. And that can be for either of the two sides there. Politically, I don't think that there's any win-win good solution. I think there's only shades of bad. As a Democrat, I tend to side more with the human rights abuses that, as Dion, yourself, and Brett kind of alluded to, has this alliance run its course? And I think before some of these attacks, I might have said, Israel can probably take care of itself at this point. So I'm kind of stuck on this one, but I do tend to agree with Thea, where she, as she was talking about not agreeing with the current administration's current actions.
Who wants to go next, Brett?
Brett.
Yeah, I can. So I largely agree with Will. There's a lot of information that goes into these. There's a lot of points that you have to consider when looking at this. There is no simple answer. It is very much shades of gray. And yeah, there's not a lot of shades of good that go with it. I mean, anytime you're talking conflict, anytime you're talking war, I mean, the best solution is to not have war, right? But unfortunately, people are not inherently good. We'd all like to think that we are, but I think history has kind of proven otherwise, that there's a lot of tribalism. There's a lot of, us versus them mentality. There's a lot of hatred that goes around. And so when you have that, you do still have to have that readiness to go to war. But in terms of the current conflicts and how we're approaching them, I don't think we're doing the best that we could. In terms of how Israel is performing, yes, I believe that we should back Israel, but as soon as they cross into the human rights issues, and if they're doing things that are not strategic and tactical in a way that they are hurting their enemies, but there are higher civilian casualties, I think that's a problem, and we should step in. Because as an ally, it doesn't just mean supporting. Like, I think you guys understand this too. Like, if you're a good friend to somebody, you'll support them when you need to. But if they're stepping out of line, you're going to call them on it. Right. And I think that's the area where we're not doing what we really should in that instance. And Ukraine is kind of the same thing, to where, Deanna, I agree with you that, if we can put hurdles in front of our adversaries, that's a good thing. But I believe that we're also in a position to where we should have the ability to have conversations with Russia. And maybe I'm just not versed in this, but to understand actually why this is such a big deal for them. Why are they pushing for this? And if it's something that we should get involved with, then I don't know, maybe we should actually, put our foot in the way. But again, there's just so much information that's there, and I'm not well versed in everything that's going on to say that I have a strong standpoint against it. But my overall point would be is if we can minimize conflict, absolutely, but occasionally you do have to swing a stick.
I think as far as Ukraine is concerned, I do feel that if a country that Russia shouldn't be able to tell us who our allies should and shouldn't be. I know a lot of the conflict in Ukraine deals with their desire to be a member of NATO. And I do think that I find it problematic that if one country wants to join an alliance that we're a part of, and then another country invades them as a result, us not at least being in somewhat of a supportive role. I agree that we should have an opinion and then leverage whatever power we can. What that looks like, I'm going to be humble enough to say I'm not sure. I'm not as versed in what the best diplomatic or economic or all the different levers of power, what the best approach is. But I don't think just being completely staying out of it is the right answer when it comes to Ukraine. Nor do I think us ever sending U.S. troops, or at least based on the conditions now, I would not be in support of us sending any U.S. troops into that conflict. Gaza, I feel a little bit more strongly about. I think that we are already past the line where our friend has done the wrong thing. And if you look at the number of civilian casualties, if you look at just objectively the war, the way that this conflict has been fought, I do think the human rights violations that we've already passed that stage. So I would like to see the U.S. contingent aid upon telling our ally, no, we're no longer going to provide $12 billion in aid in the last year, or 14 months. We won't continue to do that if you continue to commit these human rights violations. If you can't, simple things, again, I mean, all four of us, proportionality, right? That's one of the things when you are looking at engaging in military conflict. You don't bomb a building to kill one person when there are 100 civilians in there. Like your attack should be proportional based on your target. Just they're on its face. I can't stomach it. I've never been one to not watch the news, but I really struggle when I watch, what's happened in Gaza. I'm a mom. I hate hearing the stories about the children, that Gaza, 50% of the population in Gaza are children. And to know that so many of them have lost their lives in a conflict that they had no influence over, I can't stomach it. So my stance is that we should contingent our aid upon Israel, the Israeli government, waging a war that we feel, or waging a conflict that's just. I don't believe what they're doing now is defense. I think that they are an aggressor right now, and I don't agree with it.
So I almost wonder if Israel learned the wrong lesson from our 20 years in Afghanistan, that, a lot of critics would say that we fought with one arm tied behind our back because we were, not conducting human rights violations. We were trying to avoid civilian casualties. And critics would say, well, why didn't you just go in and carpet bomb the place? They're hiding in caves and they're not as technologically advanced as the United States. And I wonder if Israel's like, well, if we fought Hamas and if we fought the Palestinians the same way that the Americans fought in Afghanistan, we're going to be there for 20 years. Or
they've already been there for 20 years.
A couple hundred years.
Yeah, I mean, I think
so.
But then it becomes, do you become the thing that you say you're fighting against? That was always my argument when people would bring that up with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Horn of Africa, whatever conflicts we as American military is, at some point, we don't want to be the thing we are fighting against, right? And it didn't feel good when I was watching videos of American soldiers committing atrocities in Fallujah, like sitting through those intel briefs sucked. And so I just feel like you have to at some point take a stand and say, this is not what we stand for. And once we lose that moral high ground, or even ground is not even high at that point, then what's the point? You know what I mean? Like then we become no better than Osama bin Laden, or name your dictator. So
yeah, Thea, I agree with you. So going back to a point you made earlier, I think that it is very important that one of the very foundations of statehood on the global stage is that you can be trusted with your word, right? Because there is no higher authority to appeal to. We could talk about the UN or something, but it really has no teeth. And so when you're dealing state on state, you have to know that if a state signs a treaty or an alliance or anything of that sort, that they're going to stick to it. So I do believe that it is absolutely important that the United States honors whatever treaties and alliances it has already formed, but that we should really take a good hard look at whether those treaties and alliances still serve the purpose that we need them to serve today. And have a good, honest look at it. Maybe it does, but I don't think that. I think we've taken for granted a lot of these for the past several decades, and we haven't actually, just asked ourselves: is this still a friendship that we want to maintain? With Israel and Gaza, I think that it is a difficult situation because I can't imagine. I can start to imagine having been on that fob and having received indirect fire in the middle of the night, where you're just woken up by the sirens and the explosions and stuff shaking around you, and you got to run to your bunker. So I can kind of picture what it's like to live in Israel with a terrorist organization just over the border, lobbing rockets and mortars at you. But I can't imagine that being your life, right? I knew at some point that deployment would come to an end and I would go home to a place where that doesn't happen. I can't imagine being born into and growing up in and living in that situation for my entire life. So I can sympathize a little bit with Israel wanting to just basically put a complete end to Hamas and never have to deal with it again. On the flip side, Israel is a first world democratic society, and they should act like it. And if they're receiving our foreign aid, we do have stipulations on it. Will, you said you thought that it was the Leahy Amendment. That might be what it is. We should probably go look that up. But regardless, I know what you're talking about.
It's either Leahy or Hyde. I forget which one. Which senator?
No, Leahy.
But we do have stipulations. Yeah, we have stipulations on our foreign aid and our provisions of military sales. And so I think absolutely we would be within our rights to say, hey, Israel, stop killing babies, or we're not going to give you any more stuff. When it comes to Ukraine, I think, I do agree with you, Thea. We can't just let Russia go, hey, you know what? We're going to dictate your foreign policy for you, United States, because we're the big bear in the room. At the same time, man, it is such a between us and Russia, ever since World War II, or really before, it has been a very tense situation, right? And before we hit record on this podcast, we were talking about how just in the past day or two in the news, it came out that Joe Biden has authorized Ukraine to use U.S. long-range weapons to strike targets inside of Russia. And previously, Vladimir Putin has said that any U.S. weapons that are used to strike inside Russian soil would be considered to have been launched by the U.S. themselves by Russia. So we're kind of in this situation where, two of the world's just hugest nuclear powers, like, the next biggest nuclear power after us is like an order of magnitude smaller, right? And we're like staring at each other toe to toe, and for lack of a better way to put it, we're doing this like big dick contest between each other, right? And this does not end up well for the rest of humanity. I don't like it. I don't want to be here, and I would like us to have a foreign policy that, like the Libertarian platform says, our first and foremost goal is peace with all nations. If we're attacked, we'll defend ourselves, but we're not going to go in first with military on everything.
I looked up, I confirmed the Leahy Amendment does refer to or the Leahy Law refers to the fact that, or the U.S. will not provide foreign aid where there's credible information implicating the commission of gross violations of human rights. So that's
Nice.
That's
Good
the
job,
name
Will.
of the law. Mm-hmm.
All right.
That was all from our time in Afghanistan. That there were conversations about if we hear that the Afghans are doing XYZ, should we even be there?
Shoot them off.
Yeah.
Same thing with
all
the
right,
Qatari
so,
16 dozen cutter. So
this is, I mean, we could probably go for another hour, but I don't think our viewers and listeners would stick with us for it. So let's jump into what's been making us happy this week. I'll go ahead and get started since I'm already talking. For me, my son was diagnosed with ADHD, and it's just pretty mild. But we started looking into like books and counseling and things to just kind of help give him the tools to deal with his neurodivergent thinking, right? So I started listening to this book on Audible. It's called Your Brain Is Not Broken. And it's more intended for like adults with ADHD, but obviously, neurodivergent kind of has similar aspects, whether you're a child or an adult or whatever. And as I started listening to it, I was like, I have ADHD. and it's weird. It's weird to like say that it makes me happy, but throughout my life, there were times when things were maybe difficult for me that I sat there and I was like, I don't understand why this is so tough for me. Like everybody else seems to get this right away. Like, why am I struggling with this? And, even as an adult, just things that like the way that I think, the way that I talk, I'm sure our viewers and listeners like see it now in the way that just the way that my brain like spews stuff out. Right. Anyways, listening to this book, I'm like, oh, so many things make sense now. Okay. So anyways, that's what's making me happy is now I finally have a why for all of the things that I do and think.
You're not broken, Thea.
Not in that way, at least.
Thea, you're up next on my screen.
Oh, am I up next?
Yeah.
I actually struggled this week more than last week for what's making me happy. I think I had a delayed reaction to the election. And so I think this week I kind of was, maybe because of all the cabinet appointments and just certain things hitting the news, it kind of put me in a funk. So I was in a funk yesterday. In typical mom, I had to get up and take my son to swim lessons. And then he had like this color run at school, his school put on a Saturday. So we all had to go out there and watch these kids do this color run. And it was a lot of fun. For anyone who's never done a color run, it's like kids do like a race, but they have all these little obstacle course. Actually, they have them for adults too, and every time you go to the little station, like you go through the tunnel or whatever, and then people throw paint at you or like some kind of like chocolate, like dust paint. And so I got to like watch all the little kids do this color run, and it was, and my neighbors across the street, they were there, and then the kids were eating cotton candy, and it just reminded me that despite everything that's going on in the world, on the news, like life is really as simple as just like spending a Saturday afternoon watching a bunch of elementary school kids get covered in paint, and their joy is there regardless of what we're worrying about. So that brought me a sense of comfort. So I guess it's just what's making me happy is that you can still enjoy the little things despite the fact that the big things are still going on, and just the ability to recognize those moments. So Lincoln Elementary, shout out to the PTA for putting on the color run this past Saturday. So.
I think that's awesome, Thea. Mine are around my kids. It's funny, like most of my joyful moments are around my kids, and I think it's for that same thing, to where they're just, joyful. They look at life differently, and it's kind of fun. Dion, my son, is also neurodivergent in some areas, and just the way he thinks. I mean, he's a brilliant kid, but he just has tendencies that are very different. And kind of the same thing. It's one of the podcasts that I've been listening to, and I'll throw this out there as a plug. It's been an awesome podcast, but it's the Calm Parenting podcast with Kirk Martin. He does a phenomenal job. He's done a huge study around this. But anyway, I've actually been listening to some of those with my son. And so he hears it as well. He's like, Dad, that's me. And so it's really cool to kind of see those and walk through that. And we actually had an instance tonight where he got a little bit frustrated because we celebrated my daughter's 7th birthday. It was her party tonight. And he was just kind of struggling with that a little bit. The attention wasn't on him. And so he just got frustrated at one point. And rather than getting in his face about it, I said, "Hey, buddy, I'm actually going to go for a walk because I've got a fitness plan right now where I'm getting so many steps a day anyway." I'm like, "Hey, buddy, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to be outside in 5 minutes. If you want to join me, come along." And he immediately hopped up, went and got his shoes on. He's like, "Yeah, I want to go." And it was awesome because we got to have this incredible conversation about how he was feeling today and what he was dealing with and why he was frustrated. And it just got to really pour into him. And that was just an amazing thing for me to connect with my 9-year-old son in that capacity. It was a ton of fun. Now, another one is a little bit more fun, a little bit more lighthearted. I had the kids in the car the other day, and, we stopped at the local Christian chicken joint, grabbed some food. And I handed the food back to my daughter, and she had gotten mac and cheese with her nuggets. And she was so excited, but she just does this, "Oh, my beautiful mac and cheese." And like, she was just so excited about it. I mean, she's 4, right? So it's just awesome. But just seeing the joy in my kids' eyes for stuff like that, it's always fun.
Question: is a Christian chicken joint a chain, or is it like a church, like
Chick-fil-A,
church, like religious chicken?
No, it's just
Chick-fil-A.
a plug for Chick-fil-A.
It's a chain that he didn't want to mention. It took me a second. Yeah.
Oh, went right over my head. I was like, Christian chicken.
They're not serving today. It's Sunday.
Oh, no, I get it.
This happened
Okay.
yesterday. So it's
Right.
Yeah.
So,
All right. So for mine, it's been this operation, this hurricane relief operation. I was introduced to Team Rubicon several years ago through a good friend of mine, and I had been meaning to join and to do these types of operations. And we just moved to Tampa. We got hit with 2 hurricanes, and every house in my neighborhood has a tarp on it, on the roof. We lost trees all over the place. And I was like, if I had done this Team Rubicon thing before, they teach you how to tarp roofs because that's what you're going to go do. They teach you chainsaw skills because you're going to go chop down trees. They teach you these things. And I was like, this is a sign, the 2 hurricanes, that I should have been doing this before. I paid people way too much money to come do something that did not take them very long to achieve their goal. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna pull the trigger. This is, people from all over the country travel to what's now my hometown to kind of help everyone recover. And it's, the Milton, the second hurricane, hit like October 9th, like over a month ago, and these homes are still devastated. They still have standing water, that flooded in. So in some ways, it's disgusting. In a lot of ways, but you're helping these people on some of the worst days that they've had, and it's the buddy of mine, he had said that Team Rubicon gave him something that he didn't know he needed when he got out of the military. And I can definitely see that. I've only been out 2 months. My wife did say, maybe you should go make friends and get out of the house. But so I think it's giving something to my wife as well. But it's been really rewarding, and being able to kind of give something back, to use some of the skills and the experience that we have in the military to then go help people that are suffering. So that's what's been making me happy this week. And with that, I will remind everyone that you are listening to the Leadership Podcast, since I didn't say that at the beginning, where our disagreements can help inform your decisions. And as you've noticed today, there are lots of disagreements between us. All four of us come from different areas and ends of the political ideological spectrum. But all of these issues that we're talking about, and just to use Gaza as the example, they are super complex, super nuanced, and when you can get out of the media soundbite 7-second clip kind of world, people of very different backgrounds, political stances can find commonalities. You can find common ground to where we can start to try to make progress on some of these issues without resorting to screaming and hating each other and some of the other stuff that we see in our political lives today.
Or doing a haka chant.
Or doing a haka chant. That wasn't even from our country. Come on. But that's what we aim. That's what we aim to do here, and we hope that you're all getting something from it. You can help us out by liking, subscribing, commenting. Give us your thoughts. What we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. We appreciate the feedback. And with that, we're going to sign off for the week, and we'll see you again next week.
Next week.
All
right. Thanks, everybody.